Whenever I see this picture, I always feel like saying, alas. It's really very sad. But if we get on to the next picture, it's a little bit more cheerful. Okay, if we can get on to the next picture. Now, wait a minute, this isn't working now. Oh, golly. What's this one? No. That's it. Right, if we get on to this picture, it's a little bit more cheerful. Now, I love to start my talks with a poem. And Alexander Pope was very famous in his lifetime. He was quite a wealthy poet. He was much more privileged than a lot of poets writing. And he was invited to visit many of the great country houses. And after one visit, and I believe it was to Blenheim Palace, where the Duke's agent showed him round, he wrote this poem. See, sir, here's the grand approach. You have to imagine this is the agent talking to Pope. See, sir, here's the grand approach. This way is for his Grace's coach. There lies the bridge, and here's the clock. Observe the lion and the cock, the gracious court, the colonnade, and see how wide the hall is made. The chimneys are so very fine, they never smoke in any wind. The galleries contrive to walk in, the windows to retire and talk in, the council chambers for debate, and all are rooms of state. Aye, sir, cried I, 'tis very fine, but where'd you sleep? And where'd you dine? I find by all you have been telling that 'tis a house, but not a dwelling. Nobody could say that about Clandon. Many of our visitors, when they came in, they would come into the marble hall, they would look around and they would say, oh my goodness, I could live here if I was allowed to keep the furniture and someone would pay the bills. And then, alas, just before 4 o'clock on the 29th of April, 2015, the fire started. And it started down in the basement. There was an electrical fault that really nobody could have done anything about. Everything had been inspected beforehand. The great mercy was that nobody was hurt. The house had visitors in at the time, and they were absolutely amazing. We have a fire drill. They all wanted to pick something up and carry it out and see if they could help us save something. The firemen were amazing. They turned up very, very swiftly and made every effort they could. The fire, it was a beautiful windy April day, and the fire went straight up the south side of the house, blew across the attics and started descending onto the north side. Now, the south side was very badly damaged indeed. Everything fell down into the basement, whereas the north side was much less damaged. And in fact, the room called the Speaker's Parlour wasn't damaged at all, very damaged at all. Now, this is a pattern of the talk. If you'd just like to glance at that, you can see, I will tell you a little bit about the history, picking some of the very significant members of the Onslow family, a little bit about the fire, and some of the rooms pertaining to the fire and what happened. But then the most interesting of the part of the talk will come second, when Mike will talk to you about the amazing discoveries that we've made about Clandon as a result of the fire, and also, more importantly, the plans for the renovation. So let's start with the history. If I can press the button. Now, the Onslows are incredible, really, because they've provided 3 speakers of the House of Commons and 2 of the equivalents in the House of Lords. So as well as having incredible architectural significance as an Anglo-Palladian house, the house has a lot of significance for British political and parliamentary history. Now, this was the first Onslow speaker, and he was Queen Elizabeth's speaker. And the family came originally from Shrewsbury, and they started life just as actually yeoman farmers. But by the end of the 1500s, they were quite wealthy, and they had become sort of squire status, lords of the manor. And Richard became an MP, became a member of Parliament. He was a solicitor, a lawyer by profession, and he sat for Stenning in Sussex. Now, he was a great favorite of the Queen. He was a tall, handsome man, and we all know the Queen had a weakness for her handsome courtiers, but I think he had the sensible to keep a little bit of a distance. But she gave him Blackfriars Convent as his London residence, and also a suite of rooms in Shrewsbury Castle for his use. Now, he married an heiress from Cranley in Surrey. So this is what brought the family from Shrewsbury into Surrey. And her name was Kathleen Harding. So they were settled in Cranley in Surrey in her estate. And his grandson, Sir Richard Onslow, we've come down now to his grandson. He was very famous during the Civil War. He fought very bravely for Oliver Cromwell. He had a very notable part in the Basing Street siege. But when it came to signing the execution warrant of King Charles, no, that was a step too far for him. So he came back to Surrey and he kept his head down very quietly. And actually, while he was doing that, he bought this house from the Weston family. However, Cromwell summoned him to the Battle of Worcester, and he turned up with his little levied army a day late. And Cromwell said, that red fox of Surrey, who knows which side he would have fought on had he turned up on time. And this is how he became known as the Red Fox of Surrey always. So this was Kniff's painting of the house in 1708. Now, I think the reason why that was painted then was because the family knew that they were about to pull it down and have a more fashionable house built. So let's talk a little bit about the house. It started off its life as 7 hunting rooms in about 1541, so a hunting lodge in 1541, and then gradually during the Elizabethan period into the Jacobean period, it became extended, as you can see, a rambling house, and the bit you see on the side was the stabling and the servants' quarters. I have a feeling probably that by 708, it was beginning to look a bit dated and a little bit dilapidated. And at that time, the family had their second Speaker of the House of Commons. And that was another Richard, Sir Richard Onslow. And he was the Speaker during the reign of Queen Anne, rather briefly, actually. He was only a Speaker for about a year in 1708. But then in 1716, he was actually made Baron. So he was the first Baron Onslow. Now, I'm going to be extremely rude now. He was very unpopular as a Speaker of the House, and they called him Stiff Dick because he was an absolute stickler for formality. However, interestingly enough, although he wasn't popular in Parliament, he was enormously popular in Surrey. And when he died, he had one of the longest funeral processions that's ever been seen in the county up until that time. I think he was a very affectionate man too, because he took under his wing his nephew, and we'll meet him in a moment. But this is his son. Rather an extraordinary portrait. We're never quite sure whether it's the portrait or whether it's Richard, but he's known familiarly as Dicky Ducklegs. So he was the second Baron. And he was an interesting man, actually, because he founded what became the Royal Assurance Company and was known at that time as the Onslow Assurance. But in 1708, this was an auspicious year for the family because he married Elizabeth Knight from Jamaica. And she was the heiress for 2 plantation owners. And she brought into the family a fortune which today would amount to over £4 million. So this really made the family quite well off. And I'm sure this was one of the reasons why they wanted to have a much more fashionable house. They had the money to do so. But let's talk a little bit about Elizabeth's background. This was the plantation, one of the plantations that she inherited, St. Thomas in the East, Whitehall plantation. Now, talking about plantations, you will realize that this brings up the topic of slavery. Now, we're pretty sure that it was the money from these plantations that paid to build Clandon Park. So this is something we've always talked about when we've talked about the history of the house. There's nothing new about that. Now, this is a picture of what the plantation looked like. It was for sugar and rum. And so this is the enslaved people working on the plantation. And we know that between the time that they inherited in 1708 and 1833, when the third Earl finally sold the plantations. The slaves in number, the enslaved people were from about 87 to 133. And over the last year, we've been able to find out a little bit about some of their names and some of their backgrounds. But this is a bust that's always been in the Marble Hall. So this is a reference to the enslaved people, actually. Now, this is what the Marble Hall looked like before the fire. So what happened in 1708 and in the years after that, because it was some years before the house was built, it was built a little later than we originally thought. Leone, who was very famous for writing the life of Palladio, the famous architect, spent some time in England. And while he was over here, some of the very famous landowners, or well-known and well-off landowners, commissioned him to build them an Anglo-Palladian house. So that was how Clandon came into being. And he commissioned Giuseppe Attari, who was a Swiss-Italian stuccatores, as the Italians call their plaster workers. And he was responsible for the Marble Hall. You see the wonderful ceiling. It was absolutely beautiful. It was regarded as one of the most wonderful marble halls of a National Trust property in England. And this is the ceiling. This is Giuseppe Attari's ceiling. And you can't really see the center panel, but it's quite amusing, really. I'm not sure why the Onslows chose it, but it's Hercules and Queen Omphale sitting together, and they were at the time an item, as one says nowadays. But something had happened. He had killed a friend of hers. So she had emasculated him, and she was carrying his club and wearing his skin, and he was sitting brushing his hair like a woman. So rather an extraordinary choice of center panel for the ceiling. One of the interesting things about the ceiling was, post-fire, when the plaster bits were examined, we know that the Italian stuccatores, Swiss Italians, never, ever used horsehair, never, whereas British plaster workers did. And they found that the decorative parts of the ceiling had no horsehair in them, but the plainer bits did. So it's pretty obvious to us that there must have been English plaster workers working alongside the Italians doing the ceiling. Speaking in a loud voice has made me cough. Right, now these are the, so sorry. These are the fireplaces in the Marble Hall. They were created by a Flemish artist called John Michael Rysbrack. They're extremely beautiful. They're on two sides of the hall. One is dedicated to Bacchus and the other one to Diana, the goddess of the hunt. Now, let's go back again to family history. This is the third Onslow Speaker of the House of Commons, and he's known as the Great Speaker, which is a tremendous accolade. He was Speaker from about 1728 right through to 1761, so about 33 years. And he was one of the people that began recording parliamentary proceedings as they happened. So if you like, Hansard's ancestor. He was extremely well known and extremely highly thought of. He was known as incorruptible and with no great love of money. So a very, very interesting man. But when you start researching people, you find such interesting facts about their life. Now, of course, one of the great wags of the time was Horace Walpole. And he was a bit like Alexander Pope. Everything he said had a certain sting in its tail. So he said, Arthur Onslow, oh, far too pompous to be loved, but much too ridiculous to be hated. However, when Arthur Onslow got up to make his speech when he retired after 33 years, Walpole got up and said, incorruptible, brilliant, what have we lost? So that's quite a bit of a claim coming from him. Now, when he retired from Parliament, he was one of the founders of the British Museum and also of the Foundling School, which of course now is known as the Coram Trust. So a very, very interesting man, actually. And he was brought up very much by his uncle. I referred to that earlier, the second speaker, Richard Onslow. He had lost his parents when he was quite young. So he and his brother were brought up and spent a lot of time in Clandon. And rather interestingly, it was his son, eventually, who inherited Clandon Park. Because the third Earl died with no issue whatsoever. And not surprising, because apparently he and his wife couldn't stand the sight of one another, and they had a big screen on the dinner table so they couldn't see each other. So it's not surprising they didn't have any children. So it was Arthur's son who inherited, George. And he was made, in the beginning of the 1800s, he was made the Earl of Onslow. And the king especially asked that he kept Onslow in the title. So you have the family being elevated once again. Now, interestingly enough, his son, the second Earl, and the third Earl had a tremendous falling out, which resulted in the third Earl refusing to enter Clandon. He had nothing to do with the house. He went to live in Richmond eventually, and also none of the estate was looked after. However, there was a caretaker living in the house with her family, and also the gamekeeper, because you could imagine that for 30 or 40 years, nobody did anything to Clandon or to the cottages round about. And also the third Earl's son predeceased him. And so the house came down to his great nephew, William Hillier Onslow, aged 17, still at Eton, just leaving Eton. And he came in, to use a popular expression, like a dose of salts. He was an amazing character, full of life, full of vitality. At first, he moved in with his mother, and then he married very young when he was 22. So then his wife Florence moved in with him. And he was like the fairy prince. He brought the house back to life again. He filled it full of dogs. You never went near Clandon if you didn't like dogs. This is one of his many dogs. And also they had 4 children. They always had lots of visitors, lots of guests. He had friends from all walks of life. He particularly enjoyed dressing up. He had to be dissuaded at the age of 18 from entering the House of Lords dressed as a matador. So really interesting character. Now, he was, I can't tell you, there were so many wonderful stories about him, but we haven't time to go into all of them. But one of the very important and significant things about him is at age 35, he became governor of New Zealand. It's one of the youngest they'd ever had. And this is how we come to have this beautiful Maori meeting house, HINEMIHI, which is a wonderful addition to the story of the house, because the Ngati tribe, the house had been covered with volcanic ash, and the Ngati tribe had sheltered in the house, and then eventually they'd moved on to move away from where the volcano was erupting, and the house had been left covered with ash. Now, the Earl saw the house, and he very much wanted something special to bring back as a memorial to the 4 years they'd spent in New Zealand. And he bought this properly. He had a deal with the chieftain, who named his price, and he brought it back, and it stood in the grounds. And it's rather interesting because during the First World War, we had New Zealanders when the house was a hospital, and it was so wonderful for them to see the Maori meeting house there at the time. And at the moment, the Maoris come very frequently and visit the house, and there's a wonderful exchange between the trust and the tribe and the Maoris in New Zealand. But alas, we have to get back to it, don't we? On the 29th of October. Now, the fire happened, and it happened very quickly. And this is what it looked like afterwards. In some of the rooms, the debris was 8 foot high. This is a state bedroom, and this is the marble hall. And it was quite extraordinary. What had to happen is, as they managed to get things out of the house, they saved hundreds of items of furniture, smaller items, the pictures, which some of them were taken from their frames and carried out. And there were portal cabins and polytunnels outside the house where they were stored until they could be moved to the National Trust store properly, and where they could be assessed, recorded, cleaned and checked over properly. For the first 24 hours, they were in the village school, and the village school closed for a few days in West Clandon to allow them to be stored there. Now, the salvage took from the April of 2015 right through until the autumn of the following year. And of course, it was a heartbreaking time for everybody who had any connection with the house whatsoever. Now, this is what the marble hall looked like after the salvage operation. So when it's been really, this is what you would see when you go into it now, really, actually, because the house has been open since 2016. 2015, we had marquees in the garden. However, one of the most amazing things about the fire was the Rysbrack fireplaces, who, as you can see, looking at this, have virtually survived almost intact. Really quite remarkable. The first time I went into the house after the fire, we all went in together, groups of volunteers, and obviously everyone was very moved. It was the first time we'd been inside afterwards. But after a while, you felt this something trying to communicate with you. And it was as though something was saying, "What are you blubbing for, woman? For heaven's sake, pull yourselves together. I've still got stories to tell." And believe you me, it has. Now, this is how they saved the pictures. This was the first ONSLOW speaker. This was the frame that was around his picture. And this is how they had to carry them out, climbing over the debris to get them out of the house. And this is what the roof, of course, the roof fell in. And when we were finally able to climb up the scaffolding, this is what we saw from the view, from the roof. And the brickwork is quite amazing. It really is. Now, they had to put 32 miles of scaffolding around the house when the winter came on, because they knew it needed to protect. But behind that, it's very difficult to know there's been a fire. The house, the actual building of the house is so perfect. Now, one of the daughters of the 4th Earl, a little bit of history again, had married into the Guinness family. And it was through that marriage that she was able to buy the house from the 6th Earl and give it to the National Trust with an endowment. By that time, the family were running out of money. There were land taxes, there were death taxes, there were various factors that had fed into that. Now, in the 1960s, also at that time, when the house came to the trust, a lady called Hannah Gubby left an amazing collection of 18th century furniture and Meissen and an incredible collection to the trust, which was displayed in Clandon Park. And I'm sure those of you who have been there would have seen that. Now, this is one of them. This is a Marquetry Pembroke games table, and this survived the fire. So these are all survivors. And these are from the reign of the KIANG Emperor in China, who reigned from 1662 to 1722, one of the great Manchu emperors. And these were carried out. They were in the state bedroom. And they were actually exhibited in the V&A in 2017. They were the first things from the house to be exhibited again after the fire. Now, another thing that survived from the Speaker's Parlour was the Vinegar Bible. Now, this is so called because it was printed in about 1717 by a man called John Basket, and it's known as the Basket Full of Errors, because there are so many misprints. And instead of the parable of the vineyard, you have the parable of vinegar. So this is why it's known as the Vinegar Bible. So that survived. There are some churches that still have one, and they often have it open so that people can see the parable of the vinegar. This also survived. This is a picture of the great speaker, Arthur Onslow, presiding over the House of Commons, and you can see Sir Robert Walpole, the Prime Minister, alongside him. Now, one of the other stories that was absolutely lovely, when the curators went into the house in the autumn of 2016, they went in through the saloon door and opened the door, and sitting almost on the step waiting for them was this little Korean duck. And this is our lovely curator, Sophie Chesham, who has the little duck in her hand. The little duck is 600 years old, and it was sat there. And Sophie said it was as though it was saying, "Where the devil have you all been? I've been waiting for ages for you." So that little duck has been restored and looked after. So some lovely, lovely stories that have emerged from the collection. Now, this is the state bedroom. Now, this is very interesting because you see in it the state bed. And the state bed was seen by firemen on the night of the fire, and they felt that it could be saved. But one of the most important things about it was the wonderful hangings that are on the bed had been sent for restoration about a year before the fire. So they were sitting on the floor of the state bedroom in a glass case. So they were one of the first things that the firemen carried out. So they survived, and work is being carried on the state bedroom on the state bed right now. The state bedroom, that bed is very, very important, and the bedroom also, because it was in the old house. It was in the original Jacobean house, and it existed because royalty visited the Onslows at various occasions. We have no record of them actually staying in the state bedroom, but we do know that the Princess of Lamballe slept in the state bed. Now, she was probably visiting Juniper Hall, because there were many French emigres there, and I'm sure most of you know that. Even the great Talleyrand was there for a while. So she may have been visiting there. She may also have been over for political reasons. So she slept in the state bed, but then she went back to France and she suffered the same fate as her mistress, Marie Antoinette. So now that we're talking about the state bed, this is an excellent opportunity for me to hand you over to Mike, because I've talked to you about the history, I've talked to you a little bit about the fire, but he's going to talk to you about the exciting discoveries made since the fire, and also the plans for the renovation of rooms like the state bedroom and what's going to happen to the house. So if you'll just give us a minute, because I'll hand over the microphone to him. I've popped it off, I popped it off.
Right. Graham, can you just mic me up? I'm not used to wearing this. Hold that. Right. Okay. Just find out if the people at the back can still hear. So just stick that in my pocket. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. Anybody not hear me? That's good. Right. Okay, you can stay there. Honestly, I swear this lady knows more about Clandon than the Onslows do themselves. Marvelous. Thank you very much, June. June's given you the history of the house and the family. She thought the tragic events of April 2015 and what we were left with when the dust settled. And believe you me, there was rather a lot of dust. I'm now going to show you how we went forward from there, analysing, evaluating, starting to form a plan for the restoration, which we developed over years, until finally, recently, there was quite a remarkable change of direction, which I'll come to. So, is that my clicker? That's the one, is it? Lovely. Okay, thank you. Okay, so that's just a quick link to what June was doing. That's another shot of the state bedroom, but she mentioned the state bed, and you can see that's the state in which it came out of there, and it is being restored, isn't it, as we speak? Okay. Right. So, once we'd come to terms with this tragedy, we actually started to realize that there was a unique learning experience waiting for us here. And what followed was months, and they turned into years of painstaking analysis of the remains, inevitably highly laborious work. But if we hadn't done it, if we hadn't gone through all that, it would not have led us to this new and rather innovative and we feel highly exciting plans for Clandon Park. Whereas in the past, all we could do was really archival research, in technological developments in the meantime have put a lot more at our disposal. We can now use things like laser surveys, geophysics, fabric analysis, archaeology, and something called dendrochronology. I'm sure you all know that. Yes? I will cover it. I can't read out every word, but I will cover the contents of it. So I'll give you the picture. That's basically saying what we've got available to us to analyze this kind of thing. I want to talk a bit about dendrochronology. It's the longest word I'm going to use this afternoon, so you'll be relieved at that. I expect a few people here will know it's otherwise known as tree ring dating, right? Which basically means that, you know, for every ring of growth of the tree, you can tell, if you count them, how old the tree is. And that became very useful information because in any fire of this magnitude, the damage is done in three ways. So obviously there's the fire itself. Then there's, and probably the worst damage comes from the water hoses that are used to put it out. And also then there's falling debris as well. So that's where the damage is done. And in a house that's like Clandon, which was made of so much wood, there's clearly going to be a lot of falling debris. And that included some massive joists. So huge, great pieces of timber, which, as June said, it started in the south side, the fire ripped up through the southern side, ripped upwards, and as it went up through the floors and ceilings, these joists fell down. And in some cases, you know, as much as 70 feet. But because of their thickness, because of their thickness, they survived the fire. And we were able to then analyze the, there we go, got it. Okay. We were able to then analyze from the tree ring dating. This is one of the silver linings from the fire. This is information that we wouldn't have had if we hadn't had a fire. So all the way through this, I'll be pointing this out. And it's a supreme irony here that what we learned was because we'd had the fire. It enabled us to use dendrochronology to acquire precise information that we had previously only guessed at. So by counting those tree rings, we can now pretty confidently say that the trees, the trees that provided the wood for Clandon were growing in the forests of Finland in the winter of 1729, possibly the spring of 1730. That's a 6-month margin of error over 300 years. Every time I say that, I'm amazed at it. So let's have a look at. So June made reference to the Fireplaces by Rysbrack, and this is another something that we learned from the fire that we wouldn't have done otherwise. It's a bit difficult to see here. You probably can't, but I haven't got a pointer on this, have I, Chris?
Top one.
Top one, okay. Right, so just round about there are, coming out from behind the fireplace, some wooden panels. Now they're made out of little wooden pieces called laths. And they would have been used in Shakespeare's Globe, for instance, round about that time. This is how 18th century technology got plaster onto the walls. They basically made the plaths up into panels. The panels were hung on hooks called holdfasts, and then they were hung up there, and then the plaster was slapped on there. And we've talked about that. We've seen the basic stuff was done by the English plasterers with horsehair in it, and then along came the Italian experts to fashion it and shape it. Right, at first glance that looks like Clandon. It also looks like a bunch of people sitting around having a picnic while watching a country house burn down. It's actually not. Does anybody know where it is? It's Upper. Very good. I'll have you in my pub quiz team. Thank you very much. It is Upper, and the reason it's in there is because it was the last National Trust house to burn down. So that would have been in 1989, 30 years ago. The reason I'm putting it in there is just to indicate the change in attitude towards tragedies, disasters of this kind in the meantime. Back in 1989, the approach would probably have been, I may be being a little harsh here, but it's basically shut the doors, and everybody please come back in 10 years' time when we've rebuilt it. In the meantime, well, a lot of things have happened in this country in the meantime, haven't they? But one of the things is that we've become a more open, transparent kind of society. We want to share these things. We don't want to keep them hidden. And so the idea was that we would keep Clandon open throughout the whole process. So these are the guide. So when we started the rebuild, these are the guiding principles. And the first one is that Clandon remains open. And we've done tours where we were showing people round by the next year, taking them through what was left. We were showing them the work that we were starting to do as it was going on. I used to be a tour leader there, and I used to call it, we wanted them to share the pain as well. But come round, for members, it was good to see the work that was being done with their money. So these were the principles that we laid down. The other important one is down the bottom there, which basically says that whatever we did with Clandon, whatever we did with it, at the end of it all, it had to be better than what was there before. Restoring Clandon Park still is, I think, certainly one of the biggest, if not the biggest and highest profile project rebuild that the National Trust has ever undertaken. Right. So we then had, the next stage in the process was to have a design competition, and we invited people from all over the world. We had 6 shortlisted, and eventually the winners were Allies and Morrison, a firm of architects with a great track record in this kind of project. They've done work on Shakespeare's Globe, as I mentioned earlier, Royal Observatory, and so on. So we then, the next stage after that, as I say, we were welcoming visitors. You wouldn't, 75,000 people in 7 years. That's not too shabby, is it, for a burnt out shell, really? The fascination of fire. I mean, when I do other talks, I talk about the fascination of fire. Would people have asked us along to do a talk if we hadn't had a fire? People are fascinated. And this is where the uniqueness of Clandon starts to come out. And that's where I'm leading with this talk in terms of where we've ended up with what we're going to do with it. 75,000 people, and obviously from day one, people were coming in and they were really appreciating the ability to look round. I mean, people have seen burnt out buildings before. In fact, a number of you went around Windsor Castle, and places like that. But it definitely is something different, something unique. And it was always interesting to see people's faces as they came in the door and looked at it for the first time. Nothing prepares you for that first look at that burnt out shell. Quite an emotional experience, really. Right. We get 3 questions on the tours. The 3 main questions are, how did the fire start? How much is it going to cost? And how long is it going to take? So we'll cover the money here. All I would do here is just ask any of you who've ever had work done on your house, was the price you were quoted at the beginning the same as the one you paid at the end? Right, well, we're in the same situation here. At the moment, the latest estimate is between 15 and 20 million. Now, most of that will be paid by insurance, but there will be a shortfall, and it looks like we may have to go for a heritage lottery bid or something like that. Okay. So, if I'd been doing this talk 6 months ago, certainly a year, I would have then said, right, okay, we had a hiatus over COVID, but we started again up at in 2021. And finally, we were able to get going on site. Now, you might think, 2020, okay, we've had COVID in between, but still 2015 to 2021, it's a long time to get going, isn't it? And I think, I have a personal opinion about it. June and I are here as representatives of the National Trust, but we are allowed our own personal opinions as well, aren't we? Right. My personal opinion here is it took so long because of the technology, because there's so much more analysis you can do. There was so much more that the building was telling people that it was kind of, well, we could analyze this and analyze that before we start to cover it up or rebuild. But in 2021, okay, so we did start to get going. I've just dropped down the bottom quickly. I've mentioned the tours as well, and I'll come on to those. But the idea was to continue with those as much as possible. They were going down very well. Have people been on tours here of Clandon? Yeah, a few. Yes, that's right. They were always very, very much appreciated. The idea then was to expand the tours as the work expanded into the house that we would expand the tours and then have you could even possibly go around and watch people working and restoring as they did it, although I'm not sure I would want to have been a restorer with a party behind me in the corridor saying you missed a bit there, you know, like that. So part of the investigations that I've talked about it will be into the materials that actually make up the house, because the more this was part of our journey through the more we understand about how that original materials and craft techniques were used, well, then, you know, back then 300 years ago, well, the better the conservation was going to be, the more appropriate it would be. But it is a huge challenge. Just look at that again and imagine that's a 40-foot cube for a start. Imagine trying to restore that, all right? And the reason it's so difficult is partly because there is no record of how it was done. No plans survived. I don't know whether they were ever there in the first place, but no plans survived. But the major reason we don't know is that it was never written down. All right, the people that did this were skilled craftsmen, skilled artisans, but they probably couldn't read or write. And therefore they didn't, and they jealously guarded those skills, right? That's what kept them in a job. They might pass it on by word of mouth to apprentices, you know, or assistants or something. But we had, you know, no record of, we're not even sure which sculptors did this, or this mind-bogglingly ceiling. It's incredible. So where does the best marble come from? Yeah, okay, Carrara marble in northern Italy. Now there's a story. I'm going to deviate here because we do this on the tour. This is Carrara marble. Okay, so it's a bit heavy, right? It would be very expensive to get it to England, but this is all about Thomas Onslow. He got Elizabeth Knight's money. He didn't want to stint on anything, so he was going to have the best. So the Carrara marble had to be brought to England. 1700. How would they transport marble in those days? Right? No roads. No, you know. Okay, so what was the form of transport? Yeah, horse and cart, right? So it's horse and cart from northern Italy down to the Mediterranean coast, and then on to what? A ship? How was it powered? Sail, right? Okay, you're then coming through the Mediterranean. What was the big danger in the Mediterranean in those days? Pirates, all right? So you had to get past the pirates, down through the Straits of Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast. Well, you know, as most of you know, that the Atlantic coast Spanish, it's not a mill pond, right? So you're coming up there, up the channel, and then, you know, into London and through that way. So, you know, that's how it was all done. The artisans and the sculptors that did this came from northern Italy and Switzerland. They came across the Alps, not on elephants like Hannibal, but just you've got to put your mind back those 300 years, that kind of. So this is a huge challenge, as I'm saying. Right, let us then. Tell you what, I'll just hold us on that one for a minute. As I said, if I'd been giving this talk 6 months ago, I would have now talked about where the detailed work is now. You know, the first work will be focusing on the fabric of the building. So that's the bricks, stonework, mortar, timber, carpentry, plaster, glass, all of that, the fabric of the building, a major program of works, which would have taken about, you know, maybe 2 years to complete at least. We'll be looking at things like repairing the buildings, the chimney stacks, those which remarkably withstood the fire, particularly if you look at some of the drone pictures on the website. It's incredible the way these structures are still reaching up towards you. The balustrade at the top of the roof, which is, you know, that's got to be fixed as well. The brick arches, even repairing some pre-existing damage, which, you know, might not have been exactly very well repaired. And working with experts in all these different fabrics and so on. Because we have to ensure that the work is to the same high standard as the original craftsman put into it. It's a grade 1 listed building, and it, you know, anything less wouldn't be justified. And we're also, of course, aiming to use traditional materials, traditional techniques, passing these down, using this as an opportunity to pass these skills down. There aren't many these days, and I do believe that a lot of the contracts that will be awarded will have to include an apprenticeship. So it's a way of doing that. So it may not be the first thing you notice when you go in there, but actually Clandon is renowned for its fine brickwork. Clandon stands on a bed of clay, and therefore the industry would have been established there. And the bricks are incredible little works of art, you know, by themselves. The bricklayers took enormous care in choosing the right shape and texture, and we have to conform. So this lady is a brickworks expert. She's been leading a team which specialist manufacturers to make sure that we get as close to the original specification as possible. You will appreciate that when something like this happens, you can't go down B&Q because they haven't got a Jacobean section at all. I tell you, I've tried. Finally, I think here. Okay, so I mentioned the tours, and that's a contact that a lot of you would have had. We've just finished the program for this year. They started after COVID. They restarted in May 2021, and they were led by volunteers, of which I was one. And I can tell you, it's not easy giving a talk with a mask on. You can't. But that's what we had to do at the time. That's what the restrictions said. They were very popular. We started with 6 in a party, but it soon moved up to 10, covering the areas downstairs, the saloon, the marble hall, and then the bedroom and down into the basement. And they focused very much on the silver linings, and I've kind of hinted at those as I've gone through. The more analysis we did, the more we started to pick up stuff and realize what we were learning from this, what Clandon was telling us, as June alluded to, you know, when you first walk in there, that if you believe that houses have souls or spirits or whatever, then maybe this is a house that's telling you, I'm not ready to go yet. And we're kind of picking up these silver linings from that. As I say again, these are the things that we would not have known if we hadn't had a fire. It's the ultimate irony, really, when you go round. So the tours were focused around the many hands that had built Clandon right the way through, from the original bricklayers and so on, all the way up through to the scaffolders today and the current project team, everybody involved. They stopped in September, so we're up to date. Almost. Over a period of time, during all of this, two things have been becoming more and more clear to the project team that was working on it. The first was that the extent to which the fire had stripped most of the house completely bare and left only fragments of decoration was making these plans that we had for restoration become more and more challenging, less and less possible. And slowly we came to realize that given how little of the original decorative interiors survive, it wouldn't be a case of restoration at all. It would simply be a case of modern replication. And that's not the right approach, not for a grade 1 listed building. Secondly, the more we cared for Clandon post-fire, the clearer it became how unique and valuable this building is in its fire-damaged state, as it is. It graphically reveals the story of how country houses like this are made and gives people an opportunity, people like you, to have a completely new experience, and an experience that would actually complement and relate to all the other houses like Clandon that you'd seen or were going to see. And we realized that this information that we were getting from the house wasn't just important to Clandon. This is more general. This is information that would actually benefit. When you think how many old houses like Clandon there are out there, National Trust or otherwise, and you think how many of them are here as we speak, sitting in the same situation as Clandon was on the morning of 29th of April 2015. So this is really important information. The house has so much to tell us about the many hands who made it, all these bricklayers and ironmongers and so on like that, through to the, you know, the plasterwork geniuses. And we realized, as I say, that there was a power in this house to tell us these stories. If you look, we love this quote from Sophie, our senior curator. And we use this a lot. It's the closest you're going to get to an 18th century building site. And as I was saying earlier about the information that was never written down, it was all, you know, we're now learning all about this. And you know, it's like being given a key to decipher, you know, everything that's behind every country house you go into now. The interiors today consist of dramatic fire damaged spaces. I'll show you some more pictures in a minute. These spaces rise from the basement right the way up to the sky. Very dramatic. These spaces will now not be restored. They will be conserved and made fully accessible in their fire damaged state. And that's basically the idea. It now becomes a living museum, as it were, because it has more value this way than it would have done to have rebuilt it. What exactly does that mean? Well, we are going to introduce sensitively designed walkways and platforms. I'm going to have to read this. This is very new. This only came out in July. So those of us on the talks team haven't had much chance to get used to it. But basically the idea is these are sensitively designed walkways and platforms which enable visitors to explore the interiors at different levels under a new roof with public terraces. You can go up onto that roof and look down through it at these fire damaged spaces. Okay. And by the way, when you're up on the roof, you've pretty got some pretty stunning views outside of the, you know, the Surrey Downs and everything else up there as well. But basically, you'll be able to look down in there. And the house's interior will become active spaces again and given a new lease of life through events and exhibitions and displays and things like that. We're going to use a creative approach to perhaps even use parts of the collection that June featured, that kind of thing. We're going to, you know, have little exhibitions and display craft and art processes, and we're going to be able to tell stories about Clandon Park and the people who lived in it and the people who made it. It will be full of these stories. It will be like that. So that's artists' impressions of what it will be like with the walkways and so on, like that, and with the and with the glass roof here and so on, like that. It will be a living ruin, but it will be a living ruin. Sorry, yeah, that's right. So for those of you who like going around country houses, and I assume that's most of you here, we're saying that this will change the way you look at them forever. Once you've been round the new Clandon Park here, you'll never be able to go into another country house without pointing out to the people you're with, I know what's behind the wall, I know how they did that. Might not make you very popular, but I mean, it will change the way you look at it, definitely. And that's, you know, to some extent, it's giving people this unique experience that is the reason we're going ahead with it. So, just quickly, a timeline. Clandon's past, present, and future. We started in 2015. We've worked our way through. We are now projecting that we should be able to reopen somewhere around about 2027. But I will just refer you back to the story earlier about having had work done on your own house. But initially, we were talking optimistically, I think, when it first started with maybe reopening in 5 years. We're now looking at 12 from the original through to when it's going to be reopened. But the tours will still be going on, so you will be able to see, you know, the work as it's happening. Can I just finish? Yeah, and now happy to take many questions. Ladies and gentlemen, Clandon is a ruin, and to some people it probably always will be because of what we're doing. But we're going to make this ruin into a unique experience, all right? Modern technology has opened a window for us into how all these houses were built. Not just that, it's a fascinating look at the people who lived in them as well. When something like this happens, you can do normally one of three things. You can either knock the rest of it down and put in another desperately needed retail park or something like that. You can leave it as it was, and they've done that with Nyman's. Yeah, people have been to Nyman's, okay, where there was a fire back there in the 20s, 30s. They left it as it is. You could do that. Or you could restore it. And those were the three options. Actually, we've discovered a fourth, all right? To use a current vogue word, okay, we're not knocking it down, we're not leaving it as it is, and we're not restoring it. We are repurposing Clandon, all right? And when it's done, I hope you'll come and see it for yourself. Thank you very much.